When I caught my stepson playing in his bedroom, I decided to help him, which spiraled into something so exciting I would never have imagined. It all started on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of day when the house felt too still, yet comfortingly familiar. I'd spent most of the day tidying up, losing myself in small chores to keep my mind occupied. The house was mostly empty. My husband had gone on an impromptu fishing trip with some friends, leaving the weekend unusually quiet. My stepson, Kyle, was upstairs in his room, the faint bass of his music trickling down to where I stood in the kitchen. It was rare for us to have the house to ourselves, but the dynamic between Kyle and me had always been easy. Kyle was 22, and though he carried himself with a confidence that came with his age, he had a reserved side that peeked through in unexpected moments over the years. I'd come to appreciate the quiet bond we shared. It wasn't loud or flashy, but it was there, steady and comforting. After finishing the dishes, I poured myself a glass of iced tea and stood by the kitchen window, letting the warmth of the sunlight wash over me. The quiet should have been calming, but instead a restless energy stirred within me. It was the kind of feeling that made it hard to sit still, and after a moment I decided to check in on Kyle. His music was still playing softly when I reached the top of the stairs. The door to his bedroom was cracked open just enough to let the sound escape. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to knock or leave him be, but something curiosity maybe urged me forward. I stepped closer, intending to call out to him, but the sight threw. The narrow gap stopped me in my tracks. Kyle was sitting on the edge of his bed, his posture relaxed but focused. His hands moved with a purpose I couldn't immediately decipher, and his gaze was fixed downward. His brow furrowed slightly in concentration. My breath caught as I realized what he was doing, the intimate nature of the moment unfolding before me. I should have turned away, should have given him the privacy he clearly thought he had. But instead, I froze, rooted to the spot by a strange mix of surprise and intrigue. There was something about the vulnerability of the moment, the way Kyle seemed utterly unaware of the world outside his room, that held me captive. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun, casting gentle shadows that seemed to accentuate the lines of his face, the curve of his shoulders. I knew I shouldn't be standing there watching him, but the sight of him, so unguarded and real, stirred something deep within me, a curiosity, an unspoken question I couldn't ignore before I could gather my thoughts. Kyle looked up, his eyes meeting mine through the narrow gap in the door. Time seemed to stop. His expression shifted from surprise to something else entirely, a mix of embarrassment and uncertainty. His hands stilled, and for a moment neither of us moved, caught in a shared silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I started to say something, anything, to break the tension, but the words failed me. My heart pounded in my chest, a chaotic rhythm that echoed in my ears. Kyle was the first to move, reaching for a nearby blanket to cover himself. His cheeks flushed a deep shade of red. "I didn't think you'd come upstairs," he mumbled, his voice low and thick with embarrassment. "I'm sorry." I blurted out, my own face burning as I stepped back from the door. "I didn't mean to." I didn't know the words tumbled out in a rush, but Kyle shook his head, his hand raised slightly as if to stop me. "It's fine," he said quickly, though his voice wavered. "Just give me a minute." I nodded, retreating down the hallway to the top of the stairs, my thoughts a jumbled mess. I shouldn't have stayed. I shouldn't have watched, but the image of Kyle, so vulnerable and unguarded, was seared into my mind. I lingered there, my hands gripping the banister as I tried to steady my breathing. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, each one more confusing than the last. I had never seen Kyle like that before, not just physically but emotionally. There was something in his expression that had struck a chord deep within me, something I couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore either, and I didn't know it back then, but it had started something that eventually would turn into something crazy exciting. The sound of Kyle's door opening pulled me from my thoughts. He stepped into the hallway, his movements hesitant, his gaze avoiding mine. He'd thrown on a t-shirt and shorts. His usual casual attire, but his flushed cheeks and the awkward tension in his posture betrayed his unease. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice quiet as he leaned against the doorframe. "I didn't mean for you to see that it's okay," I replied quickly, my own voice softer than usual. "I should have knocked. I wasn't thinking." He nodded, his eyes finally meeting mine for a brief moment before darting away again. "I guess we're even now," he said with a faint nervous chuckle. "Even?" I asked, tilting my head slightly in confusion. He shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his. "That we had laughed off at the time. I guess you're right," I said with a laugh, though my voice still held an edge of nervousness. Where even the tension between us seemed to ease slightly, the shared memory acting as a bridge between the awkwardness of the moment and the easy familiarity we'd always shared. But even as we laughed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Something unspoken, hovering just beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. The laughter faded, leaving behind a lingering quiet that felt different from before. Kyle leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed casually over his chest, but his posture still carried an edge of tension. I wasn't sure what to say, and for a moment, I considered retreating downstairs to give him the space I had so clearly invaded. But something in the way. His gaze flitted toward me hesitantly, yet searching kept me rooted in place. It wasn't discomfort exactly. It was something softer, something almost vulnerable. That made me want to stay, so I said. Finally, my voice softer than I intended. "Do you want to talk about it?" Kyle's eyes widened slightly, his cheeks darkening as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Talk about what exactly?" he asked, his tonalized with nervous humor. I offered a small smile, hoping to ease the tension. "About anything. You don't have to if you don't want to, but I just thought maybe you'd feel better." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor as he rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know," he admitted after a moment. "It's kind of embarrassing." I took a step closer, keeping my movements slow and deliberate as though I were approaching a skittish animal. "Kyle, it's okay to feel embarrassed. Everyone has moments like that." His lips quirked into a faint, self-deprecating smile. "Not everyone gets caught by their stepmom," the way he said it, half joking, half mortified, made me laugh softly. And to my surprise, his smile widened just slightly in response. "I guess not," I admitted, leaning against the opposite wall to mirror his posture. "But hey, if it helps, I've been in plenty of embarrassing situations too. You're not alone." Kyle looked up at me then, his expression softening. "Yeah, but you're always so composed, like you have everything together all the time." The comment caught me off guard, and I felt a hang of something I couldn't quite name. "I'm not as composed as you think," I said, my voice quieter now. "Trust me, I've had my fair share of moments where I didn't know what I was doing." He studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly as though he were trying to reconcile the image he had of me with the person standing before him. "It's just weird," he said. Finally, his voice almost contemplative. "You're so different from Dad. Not in a bad way, just different." I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I settled for a soft, "different can be good. Sometimes." Kyle nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "I guess it can." The silence stretched between us again, but this time it felt less heavy. I could see the tension in Kyle's shoulders, easing, the faint lines of worry around his eyes softening as he leaned back against the doorframe. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said after a moment, his tone more sincere now. "I wasn't really thinking. I guess I just forgot you were home." "It's okay," I said, quickly hoping to reassure him. "Really, it's not a big deal. I just want to make sure you're okay." Kyle nodded, though he still avoided my gaze. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's just I don't know. It's hard to explain. I tilted my head slightly. My curiosity piqued hard to explain how he hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. It's just being around people is hard. Sometimes, like I always feel like I'm supposed to be a certain way, and when I'm not, it feels like I'm doing something wrong. His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a pang of empathy for him. Kyle, I said softly, taking another step closer, you don't have to be anything other than yourself. You don't have to meet anyone's expectations. Not mine, not your dad's, not anyone's. He looked up at me, then his eyes wide and searching, and for a moment, I saw the vulnerable ability he usually kept hidden. You really think that? I know that, I said firmly. You're a good person, Kyle. You don't have to prove anything. To anyone. The corners of his mouth twitched into a faint smile, and I could see the tension in his posture easing even further. Thanks, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. You're welcome, I replied, my own voice soft. We stood there for a moment. Longer. The silence between us feeling almost companionable now. I could see the faint traces of a smile lingering on Kyle's lips, and I felt a sense of relief that he seemed to be feeling better. But even as the tension eased, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. The way he looked at me, the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long, made my heart flutter in a way I didn't fully understand. Finally, Kyle straightened up, pushing off the doorframe with a faint sigh. I should probably do something productive, he said, his tone light but tinged with hesitation. Take your time, I said with Asmal's smile. You don't have to rush into anything. He nodded, his eyes meeting mine. Own last time before he turned and disappeared into his room, the door clicking softly shut behind him. I stood there for a moment staring at the closed door as a strange mix of emotions swirled within me. I couldn't quite put a name to what I was feeling, confusion maybe, or curiosity. But I knew one thing for certain, things between Kyle and me would never be quite the same. But what was coming was even crazier. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange haze. I tried to distract myself with small tasks, folding laundry, sorting through the mail. Anything that would keep my mind from wandering back to the moment in the hallway, but no matter what. I did. The memory of Kyle's expression, the vulnerability in his voice, lingered in my thoughts like a shadow. I couldn't shake. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment of awkwardness that we would both move past, but the more I tried to convince myself, the less certain I felt. There was something about the way he'd looked at me, so open, so unguarded, that stirred something deep within me. By the time evening rolled around, I was emotionally drained. I settled onto the couch with a book, hoping to lose myself in the fictional world and escape the whirlwind of my thoughts. But the words on the page blurred together, my attention straying again and again to the closed door at the top of the stairs. The sound of footsteps broke through my haze, and I looked up to see Kyle coming down the stairs. His hair was slightly disheveled, as though he'd been lying in bed, and he had an air of uncertainty about him. That made my chest tighten. Hey, he said softly, pausing at the bottom of the stairs. I was going to make some tea. Want me to make you a cup? The simplicity of the question caught me off guard, and I nodded before I could overthink it. That would be nice, thanks. Kyle disappeared into the kitchen, and I followed after a moment, unable to resist the pull of his presence. When I stepped into the room, he was already filling the kettle, his movements calm and deliberate. The soft hum of the boiling water filled the space, mingling with the faint clink of cups as he set them on the counter. Do you still like honey in yours? He asked, glancing over his shoulder. At me? Yes, please, I replied, leaning against the counter as I watched him. His tone was casual, but I couldn't help noticing the way his movements were just a little too precise, as if he were trying to distract himself. We stood in silence for a moment, the space between us filled only by the sound of the kettle. I wanted to say something to address the lingering tension that had hung in the air since, earlier. But the words wouldn't come when the tea was ready. Kyle handed me a mug and leaned against the counter opposite me. He took a small sip, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from the cup. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. I tilted my head slightly, waiting for him to continue, about not needing to meet anyone's expectations. He elaborated, "I guess I've spent so much time trying to be what other people want me to be that I don't even know what I want anymore." His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and I set my mug down, carefully afraid that my shaking hands might betray me. "Kyle," I said softly, "it's okay to feel. That way you're still figuring things out, and that's normal. You don't have to have all the answers right now." He nodded slowly, his eyes finally meeting mine. "But what if I'm scared to figure it out? What if I don't like what I find?" The raw honesty in his voice made me throat tighten, and I had to take a deep breath before responding. "It's okay to be scared," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "but you're stronger than you think. You don't have to face it all at once. Take it one step at a time and trust that you'll find your way." Kyle's lips twitched into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You make it sound so easy, it's not." I admitted, my own smile tinged with sadness. "But you're not alone. I'm here for you, no matter what." For a moment he just looked at me, his gaze steady and searching. The vulnerability in his expression was almost too much to bear, and I felt a strange pull in my chest, an ache I couldn't explain. "Thanks," he said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to thank me," I replied, my own voice soft. "That's what family is for." Kyle nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful, as though there was something else he wanted to say. I waited, giving him the space to speak, but the moment passed, and he took another sip of his tea and dead. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy-weighted with unspoken thoughts and emotions that neither of us seemed ready to address. I wanted to reach out to offer him some kind of reassurance, but I wasn't sure what he needed, or if he even knew himself. Finally, Kyle straightened up and set his mug on the counter. "I think I'm going to head to bed," he said, his tone light but tinged with an edge of hesitation. "Okay," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Good night." "Kyle, good night," he replied, his gaze lingering on me for just a moment longer before he turned and disappeared. Up the stairs, I stood in the kitchen for a long time after he left, my thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and longing. The weight of the day pressed down on me, and I felt a strange mix of emotions, worry, tenderness, and something deeper that I couldn't quite name. As I climbed the stairs to my own room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something had shifted between Kyle and me, something unspoken, yet undeniable. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I knew it would only grow stronger with time. But the story didn't end there. No. Now the climax was coming. Let me tell you, the house was quiet again, but it felt different now. The air seemed heavier, as if the unspoken words between Kyle and me had seeped into the walls, lingering in every corner. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the soft rustle of the trees outside doing little to calm the restless energy that churned within me. My thoughts kept circling back to Kyle, his expression, the vulnerability in his voice, the way his eyes had lingered on mine just a moment too long. There was something there, something I couldn't quite put into words, but it was undeniable. I rolled onto my side, closing my eyes in a futile attempt to will myself to sleep. But the silence only amplified my thoughts, and after what felt like hours, I gave up. The stillness was suffocating, and I needed to move, to do something, to shake the restless energy from my body. Slipping out of bed, I padded quietly down the hallway. The soft glow of the moonlight spilled through the windows, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. I wasn't sure where I was going, but my feet seemed to move of their own accord, carrying me toward Kyle's room. His door was ajar just enough for me to see the faint glow of a lamp spilling out into the hallway. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest as I debated whether to knock, but before I could decide, I heard his voice soft, almost hesitant. "You can come in," he said, his tone calm, but with an edge of uncertainty. Swallowing hard, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Kyle was sitting on the edge of his bed, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. His hair was slightly messy, and the faint shadows under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping either. I noticed he was doing the same as when I came into his room the previous time. But this time it seemed like we both did not care that was happening. Couldn't sleep. I asked softly, leaning against the door frame. He shook his head, offering a small, tired smile. "Number too much on my mind, I guess." I nodded, standing all too well. Me too for a moment. Neither of us spoke. The silence between us, filled with the quiet hum of the lamp on his nightstand, I could feel. The tension in the air thick and heavy, but I wasn't sure how to break it, or if I even wanted to. "I've been thinking," Kyle said suddenly, his voice breaking. "The silence about what you said earlier about not needing to meet anyone's expectations." I stepped further into the room, closing the door behind me. "What about it, Kyle?" Hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. "It's just hard to believe. Sometimes I feel like I've spent my whole life trying to be what other people want me to be. And I don't know how." To stop his words hit me like a wave, and I crossed the room to sit beside him in the bed. "Kyle," I said softly, placing a hand on his arm, "you don't have to figure it all out right now. It's okay to take things one step at a time." He looked up at me. Then, his eyes filled with a mix of uncertainty and something deeper. Something that made my heart skip a beat. What if I don't even know who I am? Without all of that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I squeezed his arm gently, my own emotions swirling, as I tried to find the right words. "You're still you. Kyle, the expectations don't define you. You're more than that. Even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Kyle's gaze lingered on mine, and I could feel the weight of his emotions in the air between us. "You make it sound so simple," he said, his lips curving into a faint, wistful smile. "It's not." I admitted, my voice quieter now, "but that doesn't mean it's impossible. You're stronger than you." Think for a moment. The silence returned, but it wasn't uncomfortable. I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, the soft hum of the lamp casting a gentle glow over the room. It was as if the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of us in this shared moment. "Thank you," Kyle said finally, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "You don't have to thank me," I replied, my own voice soft. But even as the tension eased, I couldn't ignore the way his eyes lingered on mine, or the way my own heart raced in response. There was something unspoken between us, something I wasn't sure either of us was ready to confront. Kyle shifted slightly, his hand brushing against mine as he adjusted his position. That was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a shiver through me, my breath catching in my throat. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said, quietly, his gaze dropping to our hands where they now rested side by side. "You'll never have to find out," I replied, my voice trembling just slightly. Kyle looked up at me, then his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't quite name. The room felt impossibly still, the air between us charged with an energy that was both exhilarating and terrifying, and in that moment I knew that nothing between us would ever be the same. Kyle's eyes held mine steady and searching, and I could feel the weight of his gaze in every corner of my being. My heart raced, each beat loud and insistent, echoing in my ears as the moment stretched between us. I should have looked away. I should have said something to ease the tension, to return us to the comfortable familiarity we'd always shared, but I couldn't. I was frozen, caught in the intensity of his expression, the vulnerability and yearning. I saw there Kyle shifted slightly, his hand brushing against mine again, and this time neither of us moved away. The contact was electric, a jolt that sent a shiver down my spine and left my skin tingling. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a warmth rise in my chest that I couldn't ignore. "You've always been there for me," Kyle said softly, his voice low and laced with emotion even when I didn't know how to ask for help. "I don't think I've ever told you how much that means to me." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. "Kyle," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "you don't have to say that you've always been important to me. I just want you to be happy." His lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "I don't know what happiness looks like for me yet." He admitted, his gaze dropping to where our hands still rested, fingers barely brushing. "But I know that when I'm around you, I feel like I can figure it out." The vulnerability in his voice made my chest ache, and I felt an overwhelming urge to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I found that the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached out, my fingers curling gently around his hand. Kyle looked up at me, then his eyes wide and filled with something I couldn't quite name. "I don't want to mess this up," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not going to mess anything up," I replied, my own voice soft and steady. "Now let me help you with what you were busy with, Kyle, for a moment." Neither of us moved, the silence between us heavy and charged, and then slowly Kyle leaned in, his movements hesitant, almost uncertain, as though he were waiting for me to stop. Him, I didn't. His lips brushed against mine, tentative and feather light, and I felt my heart skip a beat. The kiss was soft, almost hesitant, but it sent a warmth spreading through me that I couldn't ignore. My hands moved instinctively, one resting on his arm, while the other cued his face. My fingers brushing against the faint stubble on his jaw. For a moment, the rest of the world fell away. There was no sound, no light, no time, just the warmth of his lips against mine, the steady thrum of my heartbeat, and the overwhelming sense of connection that filled the space between us when we finally pulled apart, our foreheads resting against each other. I felt a rush of emotions that I couldn't begin to untangle. There was confusion, yes, and fear, but also a deep, undeniable sense of brightness that I couldn't explain. I had helped him, and I could see that he enjoyed it. But still, I felt some regret. "Kyle," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. I know," he said quickly, his voice trembling slightly. "I know it's complicated. I needed you to know how I feel." My chest tightened at his words, and I exhaled shakily, my hand still resting against his arms. "This isn't something we can take lightly," I said softly, my voice steady, despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. "I'm not," he replied, his tone earnest. "I've thought about this a lot. I've tried to ignore it, to push it away. But I can't. You're the one person who makes me feel like I can be myself." His honesty was both heartbreaking and comforting, and I felt a pang of guilt for the emotions that stirred within me. This was uncharted territory, and I wasn't sure where to go from here. But as I looked into his eyes, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't ignore what was happening between us. "I care about you, Kyle," I said finally, my voice trembling slightly more than you probably realize. "But we need to be careful. We need to think about what this means." He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "No, I don't want to lose this. Whatever this is, I don't want it to go away. It doesn't have to," I said softly, my hands falling to rest in my lap. "But we have to take it slow. We have to be sure." Kyle nodded again, his expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," he said quietly, The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache, and I offered him a small tentative smile. "We'll figure it out," I said. My voice steadied together. Kyle's lips curved into a faint smile, and for the first time that evening I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The tension that had filled the room seemed to ease, replaced by a quiet understanding that, while things might not be simple, we would face them together as I stood to leave. Kyle reached out his fingers, brushing against mine in a silent gesture of connection. I looked back at him, my heart swelling with a mixture of emotions I couldn't fully name, and squeezed his hand gently before stepping out of the room. The hallway felt quieter now, the weight in the air lighter. Somehow I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as I made my way back to my room, I felt a sense of hope that I hadn't expected. Whatever came next, we would face it together. What do you think of what I did? Is it normal for a stepmom to help her stepson like that? Or is it wrong? Let me know in the comments, please.